The first farm on our tour was the Statham family farm, Rosnay, near Canowindra, New South Wales. Richard and his son Sam farmed grapes, olives and more recently poultry. They have 350 acres, of which 50 acres is established vineyard, 30 acres is made up of vines planted since 1997, and a further 20 acres is planted out with olive trees.
I got into organics because my oldest son Sam had been travelling in Europe and studying there, and he came home when we had just bought this farm, when we were planning to go into contract grape growing for the big wine companies. Had never contemplated organics ourselves, my wife and myself, but Sam came home and told us a long story about what was happening in Europe. The views of the younger people, I suddenly realised, had to be taken on board. And since then, with the research we've done, and I've travelled to England and Europe myself, we found there is a huge and growing market for organic products. And on a small farm like this, particularly growing grapes, perhaps a bit after the big wave of grape growing, we might have been stuck without a contract and taking huge discounts from anyone we could find to buy our grapes. Initially, the profit wouldn't be greater than going conventionally, but we believe, especially in view of the looming oversupply of grapes in Australia, that being in the organic niche, which is growing here and abroad, we'll certainly get a premium. And in fact, we've contracted this year's production to Bottabalar, and we're talking to another winery for some of our other grapes at a price which we believe will be substantially above the prevailing conventional market price for the varieties.
Being organic doesn't necessarily mean having lower costs in production.
There is a higher cost in doing certainly the grape growing organically. The olives, probably it's line bore, they're quite easy to grow. There's no great insect threats or I suppose initially weed problems, but we handle them the same way as we do in the vines. And the weed problem is the biggest threat in establishing young vines. So we've had to buy some fairly expensive equipment for chopping up big square bales of straw and applying them in the row. We've also had to buy a large bulk spreader for spreading composted manures and lime and gypsum, dolomite and those sorts of inputs.
Richard has found the biggest threat to organic grapes is competition from weeds.
In the vineyards, of course, being organic, we can't use any Roundup or any other weedicide. We have to address the problem of weed growth, particularly in the summer. You get a lot of wireweed and paddy melon, which tend to climb and strangle young plants. So we ended up, after all the research we did, we couldn't find a suitable machine in Australia. We imported from Holland a tool called a Swingarm Mower, which is rather like the mowing parts of a Victor lawnmower, with a hydraulically driven motor attached, and it in turn is attached to a hydraulic mechanism which we can, by manual control, move this mowing head in and out of the vines as the tractor drives past slowly.
When preparing an area for an organic vineyard, it is important to do soil tests to determine what elements are lacking.
Initially in the vineyard we had to address the lack of phosphate and sulphur based on original soil tests we did. So we used rock phosphate, soluble rock phosphate, which is very finely ground rock phosphate, hasn't been treated with sulfuric acid as they do to make superphosphate. So it becomes available through the soil microorganism activity with it more slowly than immediately soluble superphosphate. But also we had to put on gypsum to supply sulphur or magnesium and a fair bit of lime. We put on a tonne of lime to the acre before we started any actual development work. And the rock phosphate, I think, probably a couple of tonnes of rock phosphate. Once the vines are planted into that initially prepared ground, we then have to put on a lot of micronutrients, which we do by foliar sprays. And we're being approached now, and you see a lot of advertising in the organic media by a whole lot of companies which are either importing or manufacturing locally a range of products based on seaweed and fish, other blood and bone type compounds with minerals and trace elements added. There's a whole range of things. It's quite confusing really, but we're sort of sifting our way through it, doing a couple of trials with a range of fish and seaweed-based products at the moment in the vineyard, and comparing that to the performance of the more traditional organic fungus and mildew treatments like copper and sulphur.